I stumbled across this Reddit thread on our Learn Japanese that was asking how to get into the sociolinguistics of Japanese politeness. And it's like, hey, that's a question I can answer, so I'm going to answer it. First and foremost, though, I want to kind of zoom in on this part of the question because the person frames this as Japanese culture seems very heavy on hierarchical relationships, and the language expresses this. Right off the start, no. You have stumbled into the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. You're not the first person to reach this quote-unquote conclusion, and you won't be the last, but this is a heavily discredited theory in linguistics. Sapir-Whorf, which is also sometimes referred to by terms like linguistic relativism or linguistic determinism, is the idea that the language we use has a block on our reality. You can see a simple version of it in something like 1984, where you have the idea that if you control the language, you can no longer think about things that you don't have the words for. And so when the person says if they wonder that the language becomes so respectfulish because the culture relies on that, no. As far as I'm aware, every single culture on Earth has a concept of respect. There is no culture where you just can be rude to your boss. There is no culture where being respectful is not seen as a virtue. The difference is that some cultures end up encoding this into language in really formal ways, and others don't. In English, for instance, we have words like please, etc., but we don't have a formal system like Keigo, but that doesn't mean that politeness isn't valued or hasn't been historically valued, or that politeness is not an incredibly complex thing. And indeed, if complexity of politeness system is a reflection of the level of politeness that exists in your culture, Korean honorifics are said to be very more complex than Japanese. But I've never heard a stereotype that Koreans are more polite than Japanese. Indeed, the Japanese stereotype of Koreans that I've heard is that they're kind of blunt. Again, not as a rule, just in terms of being able to say their feelings. Likewise, I am unaware of any culture that doesn't have a heavy reliance, especially historically, on hierarchical relationships. But this doesn't mean that they all develop something like Keigo. Indeed, having a feature in your language is not evidence of anything, just as having a bunch of sports equipment in your house means that you use it at all, or that you're good at it, or that having books behind you means that you have read them. I have read these, though. This is very important that you understand that I've read all of these. There is some weight behind what is often called a soft version of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, wherein you can say things that yeah, sure, Japanese people have historically used seaweed for culinary purposes, whereas in the West we haven't, therefore they have a bunch of different words for seaweed depending on how it's prepared and we don't. But that doesn't really give us much insight into the human psyche. Japanese people could have a society that highly values politeness and hierarchy without having a complex linguistic hierarchical system of honorifics, and they could have a complex system of honorifics that they just don't use because language changes over time. And indeed, while we talk about Japanese nowadays as if it's one thing, it's not. And the history of Japanese is incredibly complex. And not all these varieties had the same politeness systems, with the system that we currently use being one that was developed over time and indeed has changed in terms of how it's used as Japan has moved from a feudal society into a democracy, with people using the words that exist to navigate their different social realities. A lot of what we think of as Japanese, and indeed the history of Japanese, is related to wealthy people, people in positions of power, and indeed Keigo, etc. was used in the court, but that doesn't mean it was used by farmers or whatever, but they're still part of what makes Japan Japan and part of Japan's history. But because they never became literate and we didn't have tape recorders back then, their effects on the language tend to be kind of ignored or lost. So no, Japanese doesn't have honorifics because Japanese people are particularly polite or particularly value hierarchy. But of course, language is a part of society, so you can learn things about Japanese people from how they use honorifics and how they use polite language. Where can you go to do that? Well, the Reddit thread recommends the Japanese Handbook of Sociolinguistics, and I also do because I have a copy and it's pretty good. See, here it is. And it has a chapter on honorifics, which is pretty good. However, this comment also suggests that the person go in and look up terms like wakimai, uchisoto, and Brown and Levingston's politeness theory. I don't know what course they took, and I don't know how these terms were introduced, but while the terms are introduced in the chapter I mentioned, they're not introduced in a positive sense. These terms are all very, very important in the history of linguistics. If you're not familiar, Brown and Levingston came up with one of the biggest and most influential theories of politeness, which is known as positive and negative face theory. And actually, Japanese sociolinguists first came up to kind of prominence on the global linguistic stage by actually countering it with concepts like wakimai and uchisoto, etc., showing that things other than face were involved in politeness. But we're in what's called the third wave of sociolinguistics now, and none of this really holds any water because it has a very static perception of how politeness is created, with the idea that certain forms are inherently polite or are always used in a certain area, and completely removes speaker agency from the discussion. And we just can't do that. So if these terms are introduced in a sociolinguistics class on Japanese to be like, this is part of the history, that's great. But if you introduce them now as a key factor in how do you understand Japanese politeness, that course is really out of date. And personally, I have a huge problem with uchisoto because while it is true that Japanese people will hide their true feelings and then say something they don't actually believe in order to kind of maintain harmony or social relations or something, that's true about everyone everywhere. Like anyone who has heard their boss say, all right, we're going to do this thing. Are you excited? And you go, yeah. When you're not, congratulations, uchisoto. It's not a Japanese specific concept. The fact that they have a name for it is kind of interesting. Uchisoto is like metaphors come up in Japanese media, but calling it Japanese specific is going to throw you way off any kind of path that's going to get you remotely close to understanding the reality of Japan in a serious manner, and will likely end up bringing you to a very Orientalist conclusion that will not only misrepresent Japan, it will inhibit your ability to understand it. So what do you use now then? How do you understand politeness? Well, nowadays in sociolinguistics, we look at politeness as something which is negotiated and created through agency and interpretation. And key terms that you're going to have to see when you access modern research on Japanese are things like an index. This just means that a word or some linguistic element points at something. Basically, whenever there's two ways of saying quote unquote the same thing, two or more ways, your choice becomes socially meaningful as people pay attention to it. My accent, for instance, indexes that I'm from somewhere potentially, and then you may assume more things about me. So certain forms are thought to index politeness, like please in English or Keigo, but they may not do so always because context is key. And the reason of this is because of what we call a linguistic ideology, which is just your belief about language. What forms do you think are polite? Who do you think should or should not speak in certain ways and why? These are linguistic ideologies and they impact how politeness is understood, along with, of course, what we call metalinguistic discourse, which is just using language to talk about language. I'm doing metalinguistic discourse right now. And then when you have a bunch of features that kind of coalesce, we call that a register. So something like please can index politeness in some contexts, but Keigo would be a register because it's like a formalized set of items. Although professor speech, which I'm trying to do right now, is a vaguer register, but still kind of a register. So in this context then, something like Keigo can be polite, but it also can have other effects because it's a tool. In my own research, for instance, I found people talking about how Keigo can be distancing or cold. There's a really old but really good series of videos on Keigo created by the NHK a long time ago, and they actually show this kind of accidentally in action because there's a scene where two coworkers are talking and they're talking in casual Japanese, and then one of them says they're going to go home, and the other one replies and says, oh no, I have work that's still left over. You need to help me with it because it's our workload. And then the girl who is trying to go home switches to Keigo, not because she's being polite, but because she is creating distance. She's being cold because she's not happy with the person that she's talking to.
私ちょっと先に帰るけど、一人で頑張れる？って何よ？
明日までです。これお願いします。
なんだその上から目線は。
我々のチームのノルマなんです。
はいはい、わかりました。手伝いますよ。
何卒よろしくお願い申し上げます。
So if you want to actually get a more modern and kind of complex perspective of politeness in Japanese society and how politeness is used in Japanese, indexed in Japanese via certain forms, I actually recommend starting with the research of a really great researcher, really nice person as well. I've had the honor of meeting them. Haruko Cook. They have a piece called Are Honorifics Polite, which is a pretty great place to start this question. And they've edited a book, which I have here, called Japanese at Work, which is a book about Japanese people speaking in the workplace, but obviously that involves a lot of things with politeness. There's a lot of studies in this book, and they are academic written, but they're pretty accessible, and they're all really interesting. For instance, we have chapters on how Japanese people are trained in business etiquette using language and socialized into becoming a shakaijin. There are chapters on linguistic strategies involved in just getting work done or on the salaryman identity. You have one of my favorite chapters in this book, no offense to the other authors, but on shifts between Keigo, plain form, and dialects in meetings at a company not in the kind of Tokyo region. And there's chapters on humor, chapters on giving directives, and a really interesting topic of how language is used in a number of conversations between non-native speakers and native speakers at a Japanese business place. The amount of discussions of like politeness and the different forms that are actually used in like business situations in Japan will really help you get an expanding of what can be polite and how, for instance, plain form, etc. can be polite in Japan if used in the right context, as well as, again, how forms that are quote-unquote polite actually are sometimes not. Or how they can be used for what Cook calls on-stage talk, where then you kind of enact a specific personality or do something, such as taking a meeting that's been in casual form and say, hey, okay, we're moving to the next topic, as sort of an authoritative voice, which is not polite or impolite, but sort of official, if that makes sense. So Japanese politeness is very, very complex, and certainly Japanese speakers have to make more linguistic choices than, say, English speakers, because there is a more complex system. But don't fall into the trap, a very, very common trap, and one that I admit that I used to fall into a long time ago, that this means Japan is inherently more polite, or that this all kind of manifested because Japanese people value politeness. That doesn't really hold up to snuff on a global scale, and it doesn't really hold up to snuff if you pay any attention to how Keigo and polite forms evolved over the history of Japan. What is important, though, is that these forms exist now and that they haven't been thrown away, so they are something that people pay attention to when and where they're used and who uses them and how. So the best thing you can do is read sociolinguistic research, which takes its data from real Japanese conversations and looks at the nuances of how this is kind of being navigated. I hope I've given you some good starting points for that. I don't comment on Reddit, so I'm sorry I couldn't comment on this thread in time. But again, I do very much encourage Japanese at Work for learning more about Japanese honorifics in real situations. And yes, the Routledge Handbook of Japanese Sociolinguistics is a great primer. But yeah, so I don't really have a conclusion. I just hope this was interesting and clarified some ideas and gave you some things to look at. And hopefully this means that if you encounter people who say that things are always polite, that certain forms are always polite, or that linguistic forms are actually reflections of our brains, you can just look at them and say, please.